I was standing in a village market in rural Portugal, holding a bag of fresh bread and a paper cup of coffee when my phone rang and a number I did not recognize appeared on the screen. I almost did not answer it. I had been traveling for 7 months by that point, working remotely, living out of a single suitcase, experiencing the kind of slow, unhurried life that I had spent 3 years saving toward, and unknown numbers had a way of being nothing important, but something made me answer. Maybe instinct, maybe the specific quality of the silence between the rings. I pressed the phone to my ear and a woman's voice said, "Is this Marcus Webb?" And I said yes. And she said, "Mr. Webb, my name is Sandra Kowalski. I am a real estate attorney in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm calling because there is a serious problem involving a property at 412 Delwood Drive, a property that, according to all records I can locate, belongs to you." I set the bread down on a low stone wall. The coffee went cold in my hand, and I stood in that Portuguese village square in the morning sun, and I listened to Sandra Kowalski explain to me, in the careful and measured language of a woman who had clearly delivered difficult news many times before, that my house, the house I had bought at 29 with the down payment I had saved for 6 years, the house where I had replaced every floor and repainted every wall and rebuilt the back deck with my own hands on weekends over the course of 2 summers, had been sold. 31 days ago, closed, deed transferred. New owners already in the process of moving in. And the sellers, according to the documentation Sandra Kowalski had in front of her, were listed as my parents. Harold and Donna Webb of Columbus, Ohio. My mother and my father. I did not speak for a very long time. Sandra Kowalski waited. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang the hour, and I stood there with cold coffee and fresh bread and the particular disorientation of a person who has just been told that something they believe to be solid and permanent and entirely theirs has been taken in a way they did not think was possible. And then I said very quietly, "How?" And Sandra Kowalski said, "That is exactly what the police are trying to determine. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 36 years old. I live in Columbus, Ohio, in a house that is now, after everything I am about to tell you, genuinely and legally and permanently mine. I work in software development. I have a dog named Fletcher and a good friend named Darnell, who has been in my corner since the 7th grade and who I owe more than I can properly express. My life right now is stable and good and exactly what I want it to be. But getting here required something I had spent my whole life trying to avoid, a direct, documented, legally consequential confrontation with the two people who raised me. And the story of how that confrontation happened and what came before it and what came after is what I want to tell you today. But first, if you are new here, welcome to the Revenge Diaries. If you enjoy stories about real people, real betrayal, and real justice, please subscribe and hit the like button before we go any further. This community is full of people who understand that family is complicated and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is tell the truth about it. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from right now. I love knowing who's out there. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because, like most stories that end with the police, this one starts long before anyone had done anything technically illegal. Harold and Donna Webb were not bad people in the obvious ways. They did not drink. They did not gamble. They went to church with a consistency that the congregation admired, and my father wore ties that my mother picked out and they hosted Thanksgiving every year at a table that seated 12 and was set 2 days in advance. They were good neighbors. They were reliable. And they were, in the specific and particular way of certain parents, completely unable to accept that their son was a separate human being with a separate life that did not require their management. I was their only child. And being an only child of Harold and Donna, Webb meant existing inside a specific kind of loving suffocation the kind where every phone call contained an update on what they thought you should be doing differently, where every visit home involved a subtle renegotiation of the choices you had made since the last one, where the phrase, "we just want what is best for you," was used so frequently and with such unshakable sincerity that arguing with it felt like arguing with gravity. They were not cruel. They were not malicious. They genuinely believed with their whole hearts that they understood my life better than I did. And for a very long time, I let them maintain that belief because disagreeing with it was exhausting, and I loved them, and it seemed easier to manage than to confront. I bought the house on Delwood Drive when I was 29. My parents were opposed. My father thought the neighborhood was not the right one. My mother thought the house needed too much work. They came with me to the inspection and spent most of it pointing out problems rather than possibilities. And on the drive back, my father said, "Marcus, this is not the house." And I said, for what felt like the first time in a meaningful way, "Dad, I know it is." And I bought it, and it was mine. And I rebuilt it slowly and proudly, weekend by weekend, room by room, until it was exactly the place I had imagined when I walked through it the first time. My parents never fully accepted the house. They came for dinner twice and found small things to criticize both times: the kitchen backsplash, the way I had arranged the living room. My mother once rearranged the items on my kitchen counter while I was in the other room and presented the result as an improvement. I put everything back after she left. We did not discuss it. The remote work opportunity came when I was 34. My company had gone fully distributed during the pandemic, and they were offering a 12-month work from anywhere arrangement for employees who wanted it. I had been reading about slow travel for years, the idea of living in a place for weeks or months at a time rather than rushing through it as a tourist, and this felt like the exact opening I had been waiting for. I planned for 8 months. I set up my international banking. I renewed my passport. I arranged for my friend Darnell, who lived 4 blocks away, to check on the house periodically and collect any mail that slipped through my forwarding setup. I had a property management company on standby in case anything urgent came up. I was thorough. I was careful. I was ready. I told my parents about the plan 6 weeks before I left. My mother cried. Not dramatically, not in a way that demanded response, but quietly into a tissue in the way of a woman who had been rehearsing misreaction and had settled on the version that felt most likely to change my mind. My father said, "Marcus, you own a house. You have responsibilities here." I said, "The house will be fine, Dad. I have everything arranged." He said, "What if something goes wrong?" I said, "I will handle it." He said, "From Portugal?" I said, "Yes, from Portugal." And we moved on. Or I thought we moved on. I left on a Tuesday in October. I flew to Lisbon. I spent the first 2 weeks in the city itself, adjusting to the time difference, finding a rhythm, working my regular hours from a coffee table with a view of the river. It was exactly what I had imagined. The light there has a quality to it that I do not fully have words for, something golden and unhurried, like the whole city has decided that everything important can wait until after lunch. I video called Darnell every couple of weeks. I texted my parents. I called on Sundays, which was what I had always done. Everything was, as far as I could tell, completely fine. My parents began visiting the house 3 weeks after I left. I know this now because Darnell, who lives 4 blocks away and who drove past the house regularly, noticed my parents' car in the driveway and texted me about it. He said, "Hey, saw your folks' car at the house a couple times this week. Everything good?" I texted back and said I would check. I called my mother and she said they had just stopped by to make sure the place was okay, to collect the mail, to check on things. I said I had Darnell for that. She said Darnell was busy and they were family and it was not a big deal. I said okay. I made a note of it. I did not yet understand what I was looking at. They were at the house consistently for the next 6 weeks. Darnell reported this to me with increasing frequency and increasing concern, though neither of us understood what we were seeing. And then the visits changed. The cars in the driveway were no longer just my parents' car. There were other cars. Different cars. Cars that sat in the driveway for 30 or 40 minutes and then left. Darnell, who is one of the most perceptive people I have ever known, texted me after the third one of these and said, "Marcus, I might be wrong, but those look like they might be showing the house." And I read that text in a cafe in Porto on a Wednesday afternoon, and I felt the floor shift beneath me. I called my father immediately. He did not answer. I called my mother. She answered on the third ring, and her voice had the specific quality it gets when she has been rehearsing a response, too ready. I said, "Mom, what is happening at the house?" She said, "Marcus, your father and I have been talking, and we genuinely believe this, that this travel situation is not good for you, that you need to come home, that the house should be." I said, "Mom, stop. What is happening at my house?" Silence. And then she said very quietly, "We're just exploring options, Marcus. We have your power of attorney. We are legally allowed to." And I said, "You do not have my power of attorney." And the silence that followed that was different from the previous one. It was the silence of something discovered too early. Here's what I need to explain to you, because this is the part that made it possible. When I was 23 and my parents had sat me down and walked me through what they called responsible adult planning, my father had produced a power of attorney document. It was for emergencies, he said, in case something happened to me and they needed to manage things. I was 23 and I trusted them, and the document was legal, and I signed it, and then I forgot about it. I forgot about it for 11 years, and my parents had not forgotten about it, not even slightly. But here is what my parents had not accounted for, and what Sandra Kowalski had been trying to untangle for several days before she called me. A general power of attorney in the state of Ohio does not automatically grant the authority to sell real property. Selling a house requires either ownership or a specific real estate power of attorney, a separate document with its own specific language that must be executed according to specific legal requirements. My parents did not have that document. What they had produced to the real estate agent and ultimately to the title company was the general power of attorney. My father had represented it as sufficient, had been confident and authoritative about it, in the way he was confident and authoritative about most things. And somewhere along the chain, in a transaction that had moved faster than it should have, that representation had not been adequately verified. Sandra Kowalski was the attorney for the buyers. She had been doing a routine post-closing title review when something in the documentation had caught her attention. She had pulled the power of attorney. She had read it carefully. And then she had called the police non-emergency line, and she had called me. I booked a flight home from Porto that same evening. 22 hours of travel, 2 connections, arriving in Columbus at 6 a.m. with my single suitcase and the kind of exhaustion that goes beyond the physical into something that feels like the air itself is too heavy. Darnell picked me up from the airport. He did not say much on the drive. He just handed me a coffee and drove and let me sit with it. That is the thing about Darnell. He has always known that sometimes the most useful thing a person can do is simply drive. I met with Sandra Kowalski that afternoon. She had already been in contact with a detective named Reyes from the Columbus Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Reyes was a compact and precise woman in her 40s who asked questions in a specific sequence and wrote down the answers with a mechanical pencil in a small notebook. She explained that what my parents had done potentially constituted real estate fraud, specifically the fraudulent representation of legal authority to execute a property transfer. She said the investigation was in its early stages. She said I should retain my own attorney immediately. She said, "Mr. Webb, I want to be clear with you. This may involve your parents being charged criminally. I want to make sure you understand what you are consenting to by pursuing this." And I looked at her and I said, "I understand," and I meant it. I want to tell you what it felt like to call my parents that evening, because I think this is the part of the story that is the hardest to explain to people who have not been through something similar. I sat in Darnell's living room for about an hour before I made the call. Fletcher, my dog, who had been staying with Darnell while I was away, was asleep across my feet. The television was on but muted, and I sat there and I thought about my parents, not about what they had done, about them. The Thanksgiving tables, the Sunday calls, my mother crying into her tissue when I told her I was leaving, my father in his church tie asking what would happen if something went wrong. They had been so afraid of losing their grip on my life that they had done something that could not be undone and could not be justified and had consequences that neither of them had properly thought through. And I was furious and I was grieving, and both of those things were true at the same time, and neither one canceled the other out. My father answered. I said, "Dad, I am home. I need you and Mom to come to Darnell's house tomorrow morning." He started to speak and I said, "Dad, I have already spoken to the police. I need you to come tomorrow morning." The silence was very long. And then he said, "Marcus," and his voice had something in it I had almost never heard before. A crack, a fracture in the certainty. And I said quietly, "Tomorrow morning, Dad." And I ended the call. They came. They sat across from me at Darnell's kitchen table. My father in a button-down shirt, as if the formality of the clothing would help. My mother with her hands folded in her lap, and I asked them to explain. And what came out over the next hour was a story that I found both enraging and, in a strange way, heartbreakingly predictable. They had convinced themselves, truly, genuinely convinced themselves, that they were helping, that I was making a mistake by being away, that the house was a liability sitting empty, that they could sell it, put the money in a joint account, use it to help me get a fresh start when I returned. My mother used the phrase "fresh start" 3 times. My father said, "We thought you would thank us." And I looked at my father, a man I had loved my whole life and who had managed, over the course of 7 months, to commit real estate fraud in the sincere belief that he was acting in my best interest. And I said, "Dad, you sold my house." I retained an attorney named Patrick Nguyen, who came recommended by Sandra Kowalski. Patrick was methodical and thorough and had a specific kind of calm that I found enormously steadying in the weeks that followed. He filed to have the property transfer voided on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation of legal authority. The buyers, a young couple named the Hendersons, who were genuinely innocent parties in all of this, who had purchased what they believed to be a legitimately listed property, were devastated, and I felt genuinely terrible for them. Patrick negotiated a resolution that returned their purchase funds in full, with interest, funded by a combination of the sale proceeds my parents had received and a lien against my parents' assets. The Hendersons were made whole. That mattered to me enormously, and I made sure Patrick understood that from the beginning. The criminal question was more complicated. Detective Reyes presented the case to the county prosecutor's office. After several weeks of review, the prosecutor determined that while the conduct was clearly problematic and had caused real harm, the element of criminal intent was complicated by the documented belief, however misguided and however insufficient as a legal defense, that my parents had been acting in my interest and with authority they believed themselves to possess. The case was resolved without criminal charges, but not without consequences. My parents were required to enter into a civil settlement to make full financial restitution and to appear before a civil court judge who told them in language that was precise and unsparing that good intentions do not constitute legal authority and that what they had done had caused measurable harm to multiple parties and would not be treated as a simple misunderstanding. My father wept in that courtroom. I had never seen my father weep before in my life. Not at funerals, not at difficult moments, never. He wept quietly, with his hands pressed flat on the table in front of him, and my mother put her hand over his, and neither of them looked at me. And I sat across the room, and I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something like the beginning of understanding that the people who hurt us most are sometimes doing it out of the specific and terrible distortion of love. And that understanding, that does not mean excusing it, but it does mean you can eventually stop carrying their confusion as if it were your own. The house on Delwood Drive was returned to my name. The title was restored. The legal process took 4 months from start to finish and cost me more in attorney's fees than I want to calculate. But at the end of those 4 months, 412 Delwood Drive belonged to me again. Cleanly and completely, and with documentation that was now, thanks to Patrick Nguyen and Sandra Kowalski, the most thoroughly reviewed and airtight property title in Franklin County. I also, in the aftermath of all of this, did something that Patrick had suggested early in the process and that I should have done years earlier. I revoked the general power of attorney. I had Patrick draft a new document, limited, specific, naming Darnell as my designated agent for emergency property matters only, with conditions that were clearly defined and impossible to misrepresent. Darnell signed it at Patrick's office on a Thursday afternoon and then took me to lunch afterward and paid, which I told him was unnecessary and which he ignored completely, because that is how Darnell operates. I went back to Portugal for 6 weeks after everything was settled. Not as an escape. I had already decided to return to Columbus for good, to be home, to plant myself back in the life I had built, but because I had left something unfinished there. A rhythm I had started finding, a version of myself that had been interrupted by the phone call in the village market. I went back to that same village. I bought bread from the same bakery. I stood in the same square, and this time I drank the coffee while it was still warm. My relationship with my parents now is honest in a way it has never been before. And honesty, I have found, is a strange and double-edged thing when it arrives late. It makes everything cleaner and also, at first, lonelier. My parents and I see each other monthly. We have had conversations, real ones, uncomfortable ones, conversations that have required all three of us to say things we would have found easier not to say about control and trust and what love is supposed to look like when the person you love is fully grown and fully capable and does not need managing. Those conversations have not been easy, but they have been real. And real, even when it is difficult, is always better than the performance of fine. My mother said to me once, about 8 months after the settlement, "I want you to know that I understand now that we were wrong, not just legally." Actually wrong. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the power of attorney I had signed at 23, about the cars in the driveway, about Sandra Kowalski's voice in the morning sun in Portugal. And I said, "I know you do, Mom," and I meant it. And that, for now, is enough to build on. I want to leave you with something I have been thinking about a lot since all of this happened. There's a specific kind of control that comes wrapped in love, that presents itself as concern, as care, as knowing what is best, and it is one of the hardest kinds to name, because naming it feels like an accusation against people who genuinely care about you. But unnamed things have power. Unnamed things can sell your house while you are standing in a village square in Portugal, drinking coffee, and believing that everything you own is exactly where you left it. Naming the thing clearly, accurately, without cruelty but without softening, is not an act of aggression. It is an act of self-preservation. And sometimes it is the most loving thing you can do for yourself and eventually, over time, for the people who needed the boundary as much as you did. So I have told you my story, and now I want to ask you something sincerely. What would you have done if you had been standing in that village square and heard those words, "Mr. Webb, there is a serious problem involving your property"? What would your next step have been? Would you have pursued the legal route the way I did? Would you have handled it differently? I genuinely want to know. Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of a moment when someone you loved crossed a line they had no right to cross, and you had to decide what to do about it, please share this video. There are people watching right now who are in the middle of their own version of this story, and sometimes knowing that someone else came out the other side is exactly what they need. Subscribe to the Revenge Diaries if you are not already here. Every story on this channel is real and honest, and told by someone who came through something difficult and chose to tell the truth about it. That is what we do here. And I'm glad you're a part of it. I will see you in the next one.